Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. My name's Tom, and today I wanted to answer a question. This was posted on YouTube on my last video from the Tanks of World War II series, the one looking at the French R-35 and H-35 tanks. And it was a question that I thought was sort of interesting, and required a response that was longer than what I could reasonably put into a YouTube comment section response. So I thought, why not shoot a video? And also probably talk a little bit more about some topics sort of related to the question, although maybe not exactly in the question. But so let's get to the question. So I'm going to have to lean over here to look at my computer, so pardon as I look away from the camera. This viewer asks, while the concept of classifying tanks as either infantry or cavalry slash cruiser types was replaced by the main battle tank concept post-World War II, do you think the rise of the infantry fighting vehicle shows the continued need for an infantry tank? So kind of two different things going on in that question. The first half, sort of, talking about the development of tank types during and after the war. And then the second half sort of asking how the IFV currently sort of fits into that paradigm, if it's kind of a revival of the infantry tank to a certain extent. First thing I would just like to clarify that first half of the question. So the idea that infantry and cavalry tanks are replaced by the main battle tank concept. I want to correct that a little bit. The main battle tank term, sort of as it's used nowadays, really refers to the tanks developed in the 1960s, sort of the second generation of post-war tanks. Although the term has been sort of applied retroactively to a lot of the first generation tanks. But as far as British nomenclature, and I think this question is primarily sort of aimed at that, because during World War II, it's really just the French and the British that are really tied to this idea of having separate tank designs for the infantry support role and the cavalry, or cruiser as the British called them. And since the French got knocked out of the war so early, it's really only the British that I think we need to focus on. And the British fairly early on realized that they didn't need both. It was Montgomery himself who kind of called for the development of a universal tank. And this universal tank is different than what would later become a main battle tank, because the universal tank was simply a tank that could do both the infantry and the cruiser role. And in some ways, the Sherman kind of fit that bill. It did both, probably not as well as the British wanted. It probably wasn't quite as fast as they wanted for a cruiser. It wasn't quite as heavily armored as they wanted for an infantry tank. But certainly, within American usage, the Sherman fulfilled both those roles. So the British universal tank, it's different than the MBT. The MBT of sort of the 1960s, the whole point of that was that it would replace both the medium and the heavy tank. So, you look at the first generation of post-World War II tanks, the T-55, the Centurion, the M48. These are medium tanks. And I think the Centurion actually came out of a sort of heavy cruiser program initially. And all three armies still developed a heavy tank in that period. Not with a lot of enthusiasm, particularly in the West. They didn't make a ton of them, and it was mostly because they knew that the enemy was making them. So the heavy tank still kind of lingered as an idea, but sort of, by the time gun technology had progressed, we have the British 105, and the Soviets have the 115 millimeter gun coming out. These guns can penetrate pretty much any reasonable amount of armor of the period, and you can mount them on what is your sort of medium tank. So the heavy tanks are kind of obsolete at this point. So you can kind of just sort of create the most sort of balanced tank design that's got plenty of firepower on it, and that becomes your MBT. It can do both those roles, the medium and the heavy. So, and if you look in a lot of books, they will retroactively classify things like the Centurion and the M48 as an MBT. But like I say, when those tanks were introduced, the M48 was definitely considered a medium tank, because the M103 Heavy existed. Same with the Soviet side. They had their heavy tank series, and the T-55 was a medium. So slight differentiation there. The British universal tank concept of the late war period is not exactly analogous to the later MBT concept. All right, so, and that's a lot of semantics in a lot of ways. you know, because like I say, the MBT term gets thrown around and sort of retroactively applied, so you can argue it all sorts of different ways. What now, as far as the other question, which is why the British would even have this division in the first place, and were they really that unique for doing it? And I would argue that they really weren't. Everybody sort of had to wrestle in the 20s and 30s with this idea of what kind of tanks do we need and how do we organize them and what kind of units. And the problem is that you've got very large armies at this point. I mean, if you look at World War II, I mean, you know, every country's mobilizing, you know, dozens to hundreds of divisions, which are primarily infantry. Your armored divisions make up a fairly small percentage of your army. So, you know, you have your kind of cavalry or cruiser tanks. They're generally equipped in your armored divisions. They're there to perform that mission, and, you know, which is sort of based on the old cavalry mission of speed and exploitation, breakthrough, that kind of thing. And on the flip side, you have the infantry, and they just want a vehicle that can help them in assaults, sort of get through, you know, the breakthroughs when they need to. And so those tanks, the infantry tanks, infantry support tanks, aren't organized into infantry divisions. They're not part of the division. They're usually separate battalions that are assigned higher up the chain, so corps or army level, and then are assigned as needed to where, you know, because there's a limited number of them. You can't have, you know, a sizable tank unit attached to every single infantry division, unless you've got really, you know, an incredible amount of industrial power. And, you know, the U.S. Army comes close to achieving that in World War II. Nobody else does. So that said, the idea that you might need a different type of tank, a different model of tank to fulfill these very different missions, one of which is sort of becoming the main tank used in your armored divisions, the other one which is the tank that's going to equip these independent battalions that you're assigning for specific breakthrough tasks or whatever that the infantry need to do. You know, especially when you look at the technical limitations of tank design in the 1930s and early 40s, it's not like the British have that bad of an idea, and it's not like other countries aren't doing the same thing, except they're doing it within different categories. So, you know, for a lot of countries, the medium tank is what's equipping the armored divisions. Then they have either assault guns or heavy tanks that are these independent battalions that are assigned as needed to where you want to achieve a breakthrough or some other goal. So every army in this period's sort of grappling with what kind of tank do we make, how do we organize them, how do we distribute them throughout our army. You know, the U.S. Army just sort of like, you know what, we're just going to build a ton of M4 Shermans, and they're going to do both. So, you know, if you look at the tank battalions equipped with Sherman tanks, a little over half of them are in the armored divisions, but the rest are in independent battalions, which are, again, parceled out to the infantry divisions, support units. So, which, you know, is not that much different than, you know, what the French are doing in 1940 they get criticized for. Now, the French have a much larger percentage of their tanks distributed out doing the infantry support role. But this notion that sort of became popular after the fall of France, that you should have your tanks exclusively organized in armored divisions and concentrated like that, you really don't see that throughout the rest of the war. You know, even the German army starts to kind of dissipate its armor force and spread it out more, instead of just having it solely concentrated in the panzer divisions. And of course the Russians, you know, they also, before the war, had the infantry tank, the T-26, and then they had their fast tanks, which is pretty much you know, a cavalry tank in the BT series. They replaced both with the T-34 and just make a ton of those. And then they also have the KV, though, which is sort of, again, assigned for that breakthrough role. So is the heavy tank the same thing as what the British call an infantry tank? Not really. There are some similarities, though. So when the British send Churchills to Russia, Russia says, well, we guess it's a heavy tank. We don't know what else to call it. You know, again, you just get into the semantics of it. Mostly, the Churchill's just a heavy tank that's not armed like a heavy tank. It's just got a smaller gun than you would expect. And that's really the heart of the British problem. It's not so much that there's something about heavy infantry tanks and cavalry tanks that guarantees that they're going to be bad. The problem is just that the English designs were just out of date by, like, almost the moment they come into service. they're constantly lacking in firepower. I mean, the Comet. If the Comet had been available just a few months earlier in the summer of 1944, it would have been the best tank easily available in the theater for the Allies. But it wasn't. You know, same with the Cromwell. Had the Cromwell been available at El Alamein in the desert, it would have been a fantastic tank. But, you know, it doesn't really get into service until 44. So, you know, the problem isn't that the British tank design's being hampered because of the way they're classifying them. It has more to, there's a lot of other issues that just has to do with British industrial capability, sort of some of the requirements the Army's putting out, and just some of the crazy bureaucracy of the British tank development system, such as it was. And, you know, there's been a few books written on it for people that want to investigate that. That said, the move toward a universal tank makes sense because, as Montgomery would point out, you can't sort of dictate what tank's going to be on the battlefield to meet a specific threat. So if you over-specialize, you end up with vehicles that don't end up being optimized for the threat they're facing. So instead of having something general purpose that can do everything, you end up with other problems. So, you know, one example is, you know, the U.S. Tank Destroyer Force. You know, the U.S., like I said, they don't really have cavalry and infantry tanks. They kind of given up that idea before. But, you know, the U.S.'s weird concept was tank destroyers. Well, what are the tank destroyers actually getting used for when we're in Europe in 1944, 45? Mostly they're being used for fire support and for infantry support. They're being sort of parceled out to the infantry divisions and used basically like tanks. A role that they're only sort of not really well intended for. They don't have the armor, they don't have the machine guns. So they're being used as assault guns more often than they're being used as tank destroyers. And, you know, I think some of the U.S. generals realize that. I mean, Patton did. He's like, you know, you look at this thing, it's so darn close to a tank, we should just have a tank instead. Because for the guys on the front line, they're not going to look at it and go, oh, wait, no, that's a tank destroyer. We can't use that as an assault gun, even though we really need one right now in this particular instance. No, the troops are just like, well, that's what we got. We'll just use it for whatever we need. So, in general, multi-purpose, general purpose is kind of the way to go, and with tank design, and that's why after the war, people do gravitate eventually to this main battle tank concept, a big tank that can do everything you need. And of course, during the war, the one army that's a little different is the German army. Their panzers really are all, like their medium tanks are literally all in the panzer divisions. And so a lot of times people will say, oh, well, that's the way you're supposed to do it. Well, the problem is the Germans are kind of cheating. They realize that, like, if we concentrate all of our tanks, all of our armor in these panzer divisions, the infantry divisions, you know, what are they going to do? They don't have any armor support for whatever offensive missions they have to come up with. So, you know, the Germans take the solution of the assault gun, the Sturmgeschütz, and yeah, it's not a tank, doesn't have a turret, but, you know, for practical purposes, it's sort of the German infantry tank in a way, even though it's technically not a tank, it's artillery. But for the Germans, the assault gun fulfills that purpose because these are attached as individual batteries to the infantry divisions to give them a certain amount of armor capability. And if you look at the production numbers, you know, the Stug 3 is produced in greater numbers than any single tank model. So as far as total German AFV production, you know, the Stug and the other assault guns is a huge percentage, and these vehicles are being parceled out as infantry support devices, essentially. Although there are instances where they're being used as in the panzer divisions, not very successfully, and, you know, late war, all sorts of screwy things happen. So, but generally, so the Germans, it looks like they're sort of the purists, that they're putting all their armor into the panzer divisions, but the fact of the matter is, you know, they've got this other category of weapon, which is essentially an armored fighting vehicle, and those are being parceled out to the infantry, and they're being made in huge numbers. So every army in World War II, whether or not they had an infantry tank and a cavalry tank as separate models, they had their armored strength, some in divisions, armored divisions, which is generally what the cruiser tanks would be doing. And then they had others in independent battalions that are attached to the infantry units, which is sort of the infantry tank role. All right, so that was sort of a long-winded reply to a question that wasn't really even the main part of the question. The main part of the question was about infantry fighting vehicles and sort of, are they the new infantry tank? And you know what? I don't really know. I'm always loath to comment on sort of current armor doctrine, since I'm not an armor officer. I'm just a civilian who's overly interested in the topic of tanks and generally focus more on the historical aspect of things. I will say, though, that the idea of the infantry fighting vehicle comes from a very different place than what the infantry tank was intended to be. Because, of course, historically, the infantry tanks of World War II were sort of separate, you know, tanks in separate battalions that would be assigned to infantry units, and these infantry units moved on foot. The IFV is an outgrowth of the APC, and the APC was something that was very much intended for armored divisions and units, because there's a way for the infantry within those units to keep up with the tanks while they're moving quickly in their roles of movement and exploitation. So, you know, the infantry tank wasn't really intended, though, to be operating with mounted infantry. It's, you know, that's why the British didn't worry if their infantry tanks were quite slow, because they're kind of plodding along with the infantry. So, you know, the IFV, like I said, it's a different creature in that it evolved out of that APC role. So if, you know, if the IFV has a World War II analog, it's really like the US half-track, or the British universal carriers. These are the, you know, the armored personnel carriers of sorts. I mean, they sort of barely fit the criteria, though, that are moving the armored infantry around. Now, what's interesting is the IFV, though, has sort of evolved in this weird combination of almost like the modern equivalent of a light tank, since not many people are building light tanks anymore. It's sort of armed like one, armored like one. Although, you know, you're getting some heavier ones nowadays that are getting close to the level of protection you see in a regular MBT. You know, they have missile launcher systems on them, so they're almost also fitting the tank destroyer role. They're kind of all over the place. They're, you know, sort of jack of all trade, master of none in some ways. And that's sort of, I think, why you see a lot of variation in IFV design, because different countries are sort of looking at it and putting different emphasis on different qualities. And nobody's, you know, like, say, these vehicles, even more than a tank, are a compromise of a whole lot of different features. And I think everybody's still sort of trying to grapple with what the best combination, what the best balance is. But certainly, yes, have they become vehicles that provide fire support for the infantry units? So on that most basic level, yeah, they're kind of like an infantry tank. I mean, for the guys that are going to be on the front line and are like, hey, we need some fire support here, and a tank would be nice. You know, an IFV kind of looks like a tank, and, you know, it's got a turret and a gun, and, you know, it can certainly be used that way. But it's not a tank. So I'm gonna sort of say that. No, I don't think they're an infantry tank in the way that the World War II infantry tanks were intended to operate. But yes, I suppose they do fulfill sort of that fire support role that infantry need in the modern battlefield. Although, like I say, they're also providing the means of transportation, which is something the old infantry tanks certainly were not intended to do. They weren't intended to move a lot faster than the infantry themselves. So, and also the IFVs, I don't think, are meant to be operating by themselves. They're meant to operate as part of a team with tanks, with the main battle tanks. So the main battle tanks are still going to be providing, you know, the heaviest fire support within the unit. That's my understanding. And, you know, there might be some professional armor officers who are like, my God, you're totally out of date, and this is how we're doing it now, and, you know, whatever. Like I said, I'm mostly more of a World War II guy, because frankly, there's a lot more documentation, and it's just easier to know and to discover and learn a lot about that stuff. So anyway, a really long rambling video. I hope this wasn't just completely mind-numbing. So that's my response to the question. And if you enjoyed it, subscribe. If not, then don't. And but anyway, hopefully we'll see you again, and we'll catch you on the next one.